Ladies and gentlemen, the thrilling detective website and Johns Hopkins University Press proudly present Detectives in the Shadows, a hard-boiled history. It's a special digital event about crime fiction's hard-boiled history, past and present, featuring acclaimed and best-selling authors and celebrating the awesome new book by Susanna Lee. It's just a great book. I tell you, this is a ballsy book. And I'm just glad to get you guys all here to talk about it. Our guests tonight, today, tomorrow, wherever you are Allan Collins, Ace Atkins, and Alex Segura. America has had a love affair with the hard-boiled private detective since the 1920s, when Prohibition called into question who really stood on the right and wrong side of the law. And nowhere did this hero shine more than in crime fiction. In Detectives in the Shadows, literary and cultural critic Susanna Lee tracks the evolution of this sometimes dodgy character from Race Williams to Philip Marlowe and from Mike Hammer to Jessica Jones. In addition to being accomplished authors, everyone on the panel here has a vast knowledge of the genre's history. So kick off your shoes, pour yourself a shot from the office bottle, and enjoy what I hope is going to be a fascinating discussion of crime fiction and its most iconic gumshoes. And stick around after for a live Q&A with the panelists. And who are our panelists, I hear you wondering? Susanna Lee is a professor of French and comparative literature at Georgetown University. She is the author of Hard-Boiled Crime Fiction and the Decline of Moral Authority, A World Abandoned by God, and of course, the book today, Detectives in the Shadows. Allan Collins is a New York Times best-selling author of original mysteries, a Seamus Award winner, and an experienced author of movie adaptations and tie-in novels. His latest book is Elliot Ness and the Mad Butcher, Hunting America's Deadliest Unidentified Serial Killer at the Dawn of Modern Criminology, co-written with A. Brad Swartz, and the latest in an acclaimed historical series about P.I. Nate Heller is Do No Harm. He's also the late, great Mickey Spillane's literary executor and has continued the legendary Mike Hammer series. Ace Atkins is a New York Times best-selling author of crime fiction, including the Quinn Colson series and the continuation of Robert Parker's iconic Spencer character after Parker's death in 2010. His most recent book is The Revelators.
It's a tricky one.
For some reason, I thought I could say that word.
You did.
And now I'll call Alex Alice just to make sure I'm spreading the goof ups around. We don't want someone to think I'm picking just on them. But I'm watching you now, Ace. Okay, Alex Segura is an acclaimed writer of novels, comic books, and podcasts. He is the writer of numerous books, including his most recent, Star Wars Poe Cameron, Freefall, and the forthcoming crime novel, Secret Identity. He's also the author of the Pete Fernandez series about a trouble-prone Miami PI. Me, according to Johns Hopkins, I'm a writer of and about crime fiction and the founding editor of the thrilling detective website and a contributing editor to Mystery Scene magazine. But stick around anyway, because these other guys know what they're doing. Detectives in the Shadows, a hard-boiled history by Susanna Lee, is available now for anyone that's out there from Johns Hopkins University Press. Attendees are invited to save 30% off the cover price. Just use the handy dandy discount code HTWN. During the course of this thing, I'll be flashing a billboard behind me and you should be able to read it and see the link and everything. You can also go to the Thrilling Detective website and go to the Zoom page and the details are there. Everyone ready? Because here we go. The preliminaries are over. Susanna.
Hello.
How did the idea for this book come about?
Okay, well, first I want to say thank you for asking me to be here, and thank you to Johns Hopkins University Press and to the other panelists, and thank you to everybody joining us here tonight. You could have been on any Zoom event, but you are here, and for that, thank you. So I'm a literary critic and a cultural historian by training, and I've been a crime fiction fan forever. The story of this book goes back to the late 1990s when I was a graduate student at Yale, and I created and taught an undergrad class called Hard-Boiled Crime Fiction. And we did Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. We read Little Caesar. We read Kiss Me Deadly. And we even did Jim Thompson. And it was a terrific class, and it was the only one of its kind that Yale was offering at that time. And while teaching that class, and later, once I had started teaching at Georgetown and I was working on my second book, which was A Cultural History of Moral Authority, I looked at why the hard-boiled private detective is such an iconic American image. And I noticed that there is a curious duality to American thinking about individualism. One part says, we do things on our own. You know, whatever comes down the pike, I'll handle it. But there's another part of the American narrative, namely that tough, competent individuals are already out there. They're part of the American fabric. They're doing the dirty work. So we as an American people, I think of ourselves as individualists, but there's a strange credulity at the same time. Right? Things are being taken care of. And the hard-boiled is part of that. It lets readers say, in some sense, this is what my country is. And it also lets readers say, by extension, this is what I am like too. It's a wishful individual self-portrait, and it's a wishful American self-portrait. And the wishfulness is crucial because the more I researched, the more I saw that fictional detectives responded very directly to leadership crises in the United States. When you look at when these novels came out, the novels I talk about in my book, and at what was going on in the country at the time that these iconic characters became popular, you see that for every tough season in American history, here comes a fictional detective to respond to it in a kind of indirect, or in some cases, direct way. During the Depression, the Continental Op. World War II, Philip Marlowe. The Cold War, Mike Hammer. And when Nixon lies to everyone on TV, you have an entire lineup of TV detectives like Rockford. And in many cases, what we wanted but didn't get in political representation, we got in the form of fictional private detectives. And in some cases, you see a private detective embody what we want in a leader, and then actual political representation follows suit. And that continues to this day, particularly with underrepresented communities. So I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, so one of the questions I have is, why private eyes? Why not cops or plucky spinsters or florists or wedding planners? According to Hallmark, they solve way more crimes than cops and private eyes put together.
Unfortunately, when I pitched the idea of the plucky wedding planner book to Johns Hopkins, they were less than receptive. They did, however, respond much more enthusiastically to this idea, luckily. But
well, I think the private eye is a major part of it. Is the private eye is an outsider. The private eye is not part of the system. Often the private eye is someone who was in the system as a cop or a soldier or both, and then is unhappy and leaves and corrects it himself or herself, and does what Susanna, the government isn't doing, let's say, whoever the government happens to be at a given time. So there's for readers, it's a certain wish fulfillment, because you get problems solved that normally don't get solved. I mean, we all know that novels are a lot tighter than real life. I always say, because I'm doing historical stuff a lot, that God is a imaginative plotter, but very untidy, very untidy. So we kind of clean it up, but make messes along the way.
Yeah, and the idea of the private eye is also appealing because of the vigilante aspect, which, the idea that this person is somehow validated by the law, but can kind of dance between between the laws and do things in the gray areas that the cops and can't do. And there's a sense of empowerment to it too. I mean, my PI series is about how someone becomes a PI, and it's his journey to ending up as a PI. And so that quest and being empowered and choosing to kind of take the law into your own hands is really interesting. And like Max said, this tainted knight, you know, this former hero who's kind of trying to reclaim their shine is really compelling storytelling. And it's something you see throughout PI novels over the decades.
Yeah, I think Susanna, that's when we saw kind of a decline in private eye fiction as far as anything inventive in the last 20 years is post 9/11. I think we were trusting the cops, we were trusting authority figures. We saw just a complete explosion as far as like paramilitary books and pro law enforcement. And I don't think we would have had that in the, you know, past the Nixon era. But I think now we're finding ourselves obviously in the deep decline of the dark ages of the Trump era. And I think we're going to see a lot more private eyes. I think you're going to be looking back on this time in 10 years, and people don't trust the cops anymore. They don't trust law. They don't trust politicians. They don't trust people in power. And I think we're going to see that same kind of attitude that we saw going back to Dashiell Hammett's time.
Well, it's funny because that actually happened before 9/11. If you look at television, for example, at the kind of TV shows that were popular, let's call, you know, crime TV that was popular in the 70s and 80s, you had a million eponymous detective shows. Spencer for Hire, for example, Magnum PI, individual people. And then when you get to the 90s, it's all about, and it happens pretty rapidly, all about the institution. Mm-hmm. And there are people within the institutions, but you have a huge televised glorification of the institution. You have Law and Order, you have NYPD Blue, you have CSI and The Practice, and it's all about the system and devotion to the system. And the system doesn't always work. And when it does, the individuals who are working within it sort of go, oh no, but there's always this reaffirmed commitment to what the system does. Wow. And
there's also a period
it up after 9/11.
I was going to say there's also this period where after Mickey Spillane, for example, you have the private eye somewhat disappearing.
Right.
You have some people still writing. You have Ross MacDonald being very much lauded by the literary people and selling well and getting on the New York Times, but not having the kind of pop cultural impact that somebody like Hammer or Spencer had. But during this period, neither private eyes nor cops are getting any traction. That's this little period where, and that's when I trained to be a private eye writer, and then 1968 happened, and the cops were beating up on my friends, at the Democratic National Convention, and private eyes seemed incredibly anachronistic, and so that's when I personally, for the beginning of my career, went to the anti-heroes, went to the crooks. That's right. When Richard Stark, Donnelly Westlake's Parker takes hold. And there's this period, it's not very long, maybe 5 or 6 years, where that kind of story is really, really dominant. And I think private eye writers, and I think Parker, who I'm not a huge fan of Parker, but Parker really had his finger on the zeitgeist. I mean, he knew exactly he knew it was time for a kind of yuppie PI. It's somebody who was a little bit more sensitive and so on.
Well, what you're saying,
there's a period where there's no private eyes.
Well, what you're saying about the 60s, about the private eye being kind of an anachronism, I would say that at that time, and for full disclosure, I was not around then, but it seems like individualism for individualism's sake is the anachronism at that time, because you had collectives, you had collectivity and communality and people banding together, and the idea of somebody saying, my ethics are my own would have been, as Race Williams famously said, tons of people were saying that, and they were saying, my ethics are better than the police's ethics and better than establishment ethics. So in a way, you're very right that there wasn't a sort of signature private eye in the 1960s. And it was because of that shift to a collective thinking.
Yeah, I think it's a shift. I'm sorry.
I'm interested in this idea of Spencer as a yuppie. Maybe Ace should weigh in on that.
I would definitely not call Spencer a yuppie. I think that he's definitely very polished, and I think he's certainly a man. I think what Parker, or I know what Parker was doing, was trying to create a private eye that was a little bit more sophisticated and was literary. And I think that that's what allowed Parker to cross the lines between doing just genre work and stuff that was well respected, as Parker was so knowledgeable about literature that he could quote Shakespeare, and he could also talk about the value of a good 38. And also, the things that he did during that time, I think, were amazing. I mean, things that we're talking about now is dealing with race relations, and ethics and things that are so important. I find that these books now are probably more relevant than ever. I think that there certainly was a time where the private eye had gone away, except for Ross MacDonald. And to have, somebody like Spencer come back, who was a throwback to a code of honor. Parker talked about very famously, the private eye was just the gunslinger, who'd moved into an urban environment. And it's just a continuation of that American hero. I talked to Parker through correspondence years ago, and I think one of the big influences on him was obviously just Western literature in general, talking about the Old West. And so I don't want to go that far back in time, but I think it is going back to exactly what you're talking about, Susanna, which is a very true American hero.
Right.
Well, let me revise that and say he was a private eye for yuppies, for the yuppie period, with the cooking and the Boston setting and all the things that you're mentioning, which you wouldn't find certainly in Mike Hammer. He was very much geared toward that moment in time, and he did an excellent job at doing that. But the other thing you mentioned that I think is key, which you touch on, Susanna, when you mentioned James Fenimore Cooper, is that this all really does start with those Western heroes. And when you talk about Race Williams, Susanna, he's absolutely the gunslinger in the in the urban setting, and the pulp stories grew seamlessly. The pulps grew seamlessly out of the dime novels. So you have Wyatt Earp, and you have Buffalo Bill, but then you have Nick Carter, and then you have these detective characters, and so that is what segues into the pulps. In a way, Hammett threw him a curve by being such a great writer, being such a literary writer, and bringing reality in, because he had actually been a PI. Yeah. And so he has obviously eclipsed in history Carol John Daly. It's kind of not fair, but Carol John Daly wasn't near as good a writer. He wasn't a very good writer at all, frankly.
Oh, he really wasn't. I mean, you got to give him credit for doing what he did and being what he was. And he's reading about him. He's an interesting guy. I mean, from all that I have read about him, it seems that he was extremely timid, agoraphobic. There's the anecdote that I talk about in my book is that he said he was Carol John Daly in the daytime and Race Williams at night, and he wrote to give himself a sense of excitement. And at one point he wanted to know what it was like to carry a gun like his character did. So he bought a gun, and on the way home was arrested for possession of a concealed weapon. And you gotta wonder how and what was going on that happened in the space between he left the gun store and went back home. And there's another anecdote that he visited the city from his house in White Plains and was found wandering around kind of disoriented. He did not know how to get back home. So that might have some explanatory power about the arrest, but.
At the height of Mickey Spillane's fame, right when he had done Kiss Me Deadly, he wrote Carol John Daly a fan letter. You know about this. He wrote him a fan letter and said, I couldn't have created my camera if Race Williams hadn't come first. I loved your stories when I was a kid. And Daly turned it over to his agent, who threatened to sue Mickey. And Mickey had offered to do a Mike Hammer / Race Williams story, which kind of would have helped Carol John Daly's career at that point in time.
It would.
But he took it the wrong way, or his agent did.
Alas.
I'd be interested to know, with Alex, with your books and what you write about with your private eye, who are your primary influences? Where did Pete Fernandez come from? Who are you really influenced by?
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting to me about the PI genre is just kind of the inertia we see. And, Spencer's really the bridge between the more episodic PIs. Marlowe, there's no continuity from book to book. There's little things. And even Archer, which started very much as a Marlowe riff, became its own exploration of evil. But for me, it's PIs like Nick Stefanos and the George Pelecanos trilogy, and Pat and Angie, which Dennis Lehane's great series, and Laura Lippman's Tess Monahan books. I think what I liked about those books is it was much more, not just about the case, but it was also a lot about, what these characters were going through. And from book to book, they would evolve. So, for Pete, if you read Silent City, the first one, it's a very different character from the last one. He's gone through literal recovery and from injuries and his own addiction. So I think that's what we've seen the genre kind of become. It's less, just standalone episodes that have no connectivity. I don't know. I mean, you can probably speak to this too, picking up the Spencer books, but you've got almost your own continuity going. You carry the torch, but it's like a part of the bigger arc.
I think people are probably more open to that than they were years ago, especially going back to the years of the pulp, or the type of stuff that Hammett was writing back in the 20s. I think that people now are more willing to, especially speaking of novels, buy into the idea of continuity. So we have a little bit more freedom there. I think that's probably even connected to what we're watching now on streaming television. So, but yeah, I like that. I like seeing the characters change and grow and connecting from book to book.
And that's actually something that Ross McDonald, who I don't talk about, but that's something that Ross McDonald did way back in the day, is sort of turn that lens inward, and talk and think about what he was doing and what he was thinking. And
that's where we get the great psychology. It's like we think about all the masters and which ones brought us certain things, and Ross McDonald brought that deep psychology, which also feeds into the Parker books, and then different aspects that we're discussing right now. But I think about going back to Hammett. For me, I wrote a book about Hammett in his life in the 20s when he was a Pinkerton detective. So I spent a lot of time getting to know him, his world, what his worldview was, and I think that Hammett would be he wouldn't be very shocked by the times we're living in right now. I think he would recognize what we're dealing with. And I think he warned us about certain political influences and the dark side of nature, the dark side of America. And I find that very interesting that he was born of that era, and now we're coming back around to it, even down to the idea of the Spanish flu.
Yeah, I don't think there's anybody now who would balk at the idea of putting Red Harvest on a capitalism syllabus. I think right now it would. Max, you know what I'm talking about.
Well, yeah, I don't know if you've heard the story, but
I'm familiar. I know the story. And it's how you did that, and it's.
When I was at the University of Iowa at the writers' workshop, and was defending myself by saying I was there, but I was the black sheep. And at least till I sold my book, and no one else sold a book that year. But I was in a class that was discussing social topics in terms, looking at literature and talking about them in the context of social topics, much like what you do in the book, Susanna. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about capitalism, and I raised my little hand, this is probably around 1971, and said, well, there's a very interesting book to look at in terms of capitalism, and that's Red Harvest. And the class froze, and the instructor looked at me, and it really was like I passed wind moment. And they were embarrassed for me that I would mention a book by Dashiell Hammett in this class where they're talking about Fitzgerald and Hemingway, etc. About 2 years later, I was at Iowa Book and Supply, which was a bookstore where you went to buy your textbooks, but you also could buy any other book there. So I was there shopping, and And I just happened to glance over at that class, and that class now had Red Harvest assigned as part of their syllabus, as you say. And that was this moment, and I was right there at that moment where it went from nobody would think about mentioning Chandler or Hammett or James M. Cain, much less Jim Thompson or any of these other people. And then suddenly, in the early 70s, they began actually teaching them in class.
What's
And
amazing is that my hard-boiled students back in the 90s, they loved Jim Thompson. I thought that they were going to reject him out of hand. They loved Jim Thompson. I wanted to ask Ace a question, and it's about the idea of Spencer being sort of this not for yuppies, because there weren't really yuppies at the time, not in so many words, but I'm wondering if he had the clientele that he had, because at that time, it seems to me that it would have been problematic for a well-placed white guy to be the problem solver at the time that he was writing his books. Like, do you think that that's why he went the sort of a little bit fey, a little bit I'm a gourmet cook route?
You mean not to make it so hard-boiled and so tough guy? And,
Yeah.
you know, I don't think so. I really think, and if you go back to those early novels that Parker wrote, let's face it, he transported Marlowe to modern-day Boston.
That's
And
true.
I think there was so much, he was such a romantic that he loved the idea of bringing life back to Marlowe and finding Marlowe. He's Marlowe with jogging shoes, and finding himself in the 1970s. So I don't find him any more sensitive than Marlowe was. I mean, Marlowe tried to cover it up a lot more. He didn't certainly talk to a therapist about it, but he still had a lot of inner turmoil. He was a very sensitive man, and I think that's what Parker was. As far as the cooking and that was just Bob. I mean, Bob loved to cook. Bob loved food, and it was just he was kind of a snob in that way. He kind of liked the idea that he got, you read those early books, and it was so unbelievable to get real German beer. You know how culturally, how crazy it was in the 70s. A man is cooking. Oh my God, But it was. I mean, Joan Parker was a dear friend of mine, and the idea that Bob would cook dinner at night and stuff was kind of strange for them in suburbia, 1970s Boston. But I think that's just who he was. I think it finally, and I think as the books progressed, Spencer became more like Parker, and I think he developed his own voice. But I mean, again, I can't say enough about what Bob did at that time, taking on certain issues. You got to imagine, I'm sure you've written about this, Susanna, but talking about 1970s Boston is not an idyllic place. Right. In fact, there's a terrific book called Dirty Old Boston about 1960s, 1970s Boston. I mean, this is in the height of, urban renewal. Southie is at its peak, Whitey Bulger. There's the busing issues that are going on, the race relations. I mean, this is a volatile time. And for Bob to have created a character like Hawk, even though we can find some of the things in that presentation of Hawk now in 2020 that might be problematic, I think it was a very bold step. And later on, creating a character like Rachel Wallace to take on, writing about a woman who's a lesbian and talking about issues of gender and the types of discussions that Parker was having. So I like those books because it was really, I think it was pushing us. And I think that anyone, if we think about the character just being a hard-boiled hero, I think that's what made him unique. That's what made a character like Spencer, above the rest.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just want to point out another character he created that was revolutionary was, even though apparently everyone in the world except for 4 of us hate her, Susan Silverman was a character no one had seen before. A girlfriend who was there for more than 3 books, who was sexy and existed for more than to be kidnapped.
Yeah, I don't think Susan was never kidnapped. Susan's never kidnapped. And
no,
not
such a core. It's true.
And
I'm sorry.
then,
it's such a core part of the PI genre is the supporting cast. You have it's not just about the detective. It's about the you know, the partner or the romantic interest that lasts more than a book. It's something that I'm drawn to as a reader, and I tried to do it in my books too, just to build out that group of people beyond just the central PI.
Right, and I'm glad, Alex, that you said that, because that's something that I got to at the end of my book, and that I think any book about, or any study of crime fiction or detective fiction moving forward has to see that, you know, individualism runs up against a wall, you know, or solitude runs up against a wall. And that the important work is done in community. The important work is done in a collaborative way. Even if you, you know, the trick, and, you know, you do this, Alex, in your work, you know, is to have a character who is unique, you know, somewhat alienated and interesting as a person, but not self-obsessed in an unattractive way, not, you know, a resident of such a bubble as to exclude everybody else. And, you know, there are people, you know, close, semi-far, farther, and, you know, that's what makes the world go round. And also that's what makes justice happen. And I think that's a really exciting thing that we're seeing now. In the 60s, when social justice movements became collective, the private eye genre just sort of went, you know, hands off. And now social justice movements are out in full force, thank heavens. And the private eye movement is there too. But those private eyes are working in tandem with others. And that's what we're learning to do now.
Susan, what was your take on the absence of female protagonists in the history of private eye fiction? Is that a result of the publishing world, or was it a result of the readership of that time, or were you able to uncover any characters that we don't know about that have been forgotten to history? Well,
I will say this is not a book that I've been reading recently and that I absolutely love and that I just want to mention for everybody is Blanche on the Lam by Barbara Neely, published in 1992. Not at all the first female private detective, but a terrific book. So
it's fantastic.
Yes. And what I think my book focuses on the private detective, not just as as a character who inhabits a fictional world, but as a character who resonates throughout an entire culture. And culture takes a while to catch up. So there were strong, fabulous, interesting female private eyes for decades before people would even entertain the idea of a female president, right? And I do think there's a very direct continuum between private detectives in fiction and actual representation in the world.
Well, there's no question that Mike Hammer's Velda does get kidnapped now and then. But there's also no question that in 1947, Spillane gave her a PI license, and that she's the partner in the agency, and she's a very active part of that entire narrative. It's really only 3 people in that cast, and she's carries a gun. She does all of that stuff, and Kevin probably won't mind that I mention Ms. Tree.
Yes.
The comic strip character, the comic book character that Terry Beatty and I created in 1980. Right. And and we did that. It was the longest running private eye comic book, not female private eye comic book, the longest running private eye comic book of all time. It ran something like 70 issues, and it ran into the early 90s. Right. And nobody talks about it, frankly. Nobody talks about it because
I do.
It's a comic on the one hand, and on the other hand, 2 guys wrote it. You would think somebody could have mistaken Terry Beatty for a woman, but nobody was that smart.
And his
but so some of us out here have been working that side of the street. Am I overstating, Kevin?
No, no. In fact, that's one of the interesting things, because Suzanne wrote a, was it 280-page book? She didn't write a 3,000-page
Right.
encyclopedia. That's the weird thing, because often you hear people complaining about how all private eyes are pale male psychopaths who shoot everyone in the head. But if you look back over the genre, it's, I mean, there have been women. There was Cleve Adams, who was probably as right-wing as they come, and yet one of his pulp characters was a female private eye with her Hispanic partner, and they were in a ton of pulp stories. And you're talking about.
Sorry, I wanted to point out there's a couple of, somebody said in the chat, what about V.I. Warshawski? Yes, I mean, Blanche White was not the first. Of course, there was Sarah
Stu Grafton and Marcia Muller.
Marcia Muller.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's
and,
definitely been some. Oh, I'm sorry.
But yeah, no, I didn't want to give the impression that the Blanche.
No, but
Blanche
like
White
even
was
in Max's Miss Tree series, there's a gay character, and yet there was also Joseph Hanson's Dave Brandstetter, gay insurance investigator back in I think the late 60s. There was Ed Lacey, whose Black Private Eye hero won an Edgar. And that he was a Black private eye. Ed Lacey was, I think, a Jewish guy, though, married to a Black woman, sort of like the Drifters or something.
So, Susanna, what were your parameters as far as not only characters that really, you know, influenced modern culture, but what were just, they had to have a license. You couldn't do Travis McGee because he's unlicensed. Was that kind of what were your qualifications of being included?
My qualifications for being included were people who sold. Basically, people who were popular. The Continental Op is not a private detective, you know, strictly speaking, because he
works for a group.
Right, he works for the, you know, what is it, the old man, right? And who, I mean, then I've got, I did finish up the book looking in the last chapter. I looked at some characters from The Wire. I looked at some characters from True Detective, and finally Jessica Jones. So the criteria was to be popular, was to be resonant across the board, was to be a known American name. Yeah. And because the entire book is talking about how these are kind of shadow figures in American history. Right. And even for people who aren't big crime fiction fans or don't think of themselves, they still know who Philip Marlowe is. They still know who Mike Hammer is. They still know who Jim Rockford is. These are people who are in the atmosphere, who've kind of made it into the air we breathe. So that essentially was my criteria. And unfortunately, it is the reason that I didn't include, you know, it's not a book that says, here's the women, here's the men, here's the white, here's the people of color. It doesn't talk about everybody. It talks about what the American purchasing and watching and reading public at its lowest common denominator bought and paid attention to.
Well, Susanna,
and if I can, oh, I'm sorry.
You know, I'll just tell you one thing, and then Alex, I wanted to, if we could segue, I wanted to talk more about Jessica Jones, because Susanna, I know you have a lot of Jessica Jones in your book, and I know, Alex, you know a lot about Jessica Jones, and I'm a huge fan of that show. I really hated to see it end, but I have a quick story, if you'll indulge me. Years ago, I got to spend some time with Stephen Cannell, who created Rockford, and he was a wonderful guy. I don't, long story how I ended up in his office, but he should have never allowed me in there, but I was in his office. And we were talking about it, and he talked about how Rockford almost never happened. And he said the whole idea when he was creating this character with Jim Huggins, is that right? Roy Huggins, is they wanted to do exactly the opposite of what we expect from the private eye. The private eye genre had been so well worn, and everything, you know, all the copies of Mickey Spillane and everything you expect. You know, he doesn't have a swanky pad. He lives in a trailer. He's a loner. Well, he's not really a loner. He has his dad is always getting on his case, trying to get him to quit, become a long haul truck driver. Rockford hates guns. He keeps it in a cookie jar. He rarely wins the fight. He gets beat up. He's more like, in many ways, going back to almost Sam Spade. He always wants to get paid. He doesn't do things for free. And so he said that he went and pitched this story to NBC and went through the whole thing about how this was the opposite of the private eye that we expect. That's why we can come back and do something kind of unusual. This is going to be, something kind of revolutionary. And this is before Garner was even attached. And he said that the head of NBC Universal or whoever at that time leaned forward after that he and Huggins had done this pitch. And he said, I think we have a hit. And Cannell said they leaned forward in their chairs and they're like, okay. He said, but I want you to do one thing. If you do this one thing, I think we have a show. And they're like, yeah, what is it? And the executive said, I want you to make Rockford a midget. And they said, midget, why a midget? And he said, well, think about it. All the heroes on TV right now have some kind of, issues. It's like we've got, Cannon, he's fat. We got Barnaby Jones, he's old. We've got all these different, Ironside in the Ironside of the wheelchair. And he said, we got to make him a midget. And he said, it was only through James Garner coming on board did we have, a hero who was not height deficient. So that's how that came about.
Well, they really did, though. Rockford really was, once I guess Garner came on board, was designed to be Brett Maverick, Private Eye. In the one hand, his character from the 50s that was so successful, but also the Marlowe movie that Garner made was very much a dry run for Rockford, and the Rockford pilot actually recycled some lines.
Yeah.
From recycled. Well, the one I remember is Marlowe's being beaten up by a bunch of thugs, and he says to one of them, "Does your mother know what you do for a living?" That line is in the Rockford pilot.
Yeah.
So that really, so the line you're drawing, Susanna, from Marlowe to Rockford is fairly direct.
Yeah. No, I'm aware of that.
It was very much intentional.
And another fun fact about Rockford is that in his days of acting in Westerns, there was, and I don't know if he was, I don't think he shared, that there was any sharing of screen time, but Ronald Reagan, who later, left the acting field to pursue other career opportunities, was also an alumnus of now I've forgotten what it is, but it's in the book. One of the Western shows that James Garner was involved in, and also an alumnus of one of the shows that David Jansen's, who was in Harry O, which I also talk about in the book. Yeah, they were all in the same soup and then went in different directions, one into one kind of fantasy and one into another.
The other thing, Susanna, I think what's interesting, I think sometimes people do equate noir, private eye, stuff with being very conservative values. They think it's all about justice and then, how do you explain, Rockford, which certainly had a lot of James Garner in him. And then, Hammett, of course, Hammett being the most famous private eye writer of all time. How do they explain his politics? One thing I'll leave you at this point, which I'm sure you've got a great quote about Hammett, is that, in his novels, there's never truly any order restored. There's just temporary order. And then we know things are going to go back exactly the way they've always been. And I think that's so true of the times we're living in today. I think it's very hard for us to imagine that any order is going to be restored for a very long time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that, in a way, in the book business and in the movie business, that's real. And it also sells, because if everything is all tied up, then you're not going to need to buy the next book.
Yeah, you need a sense of chaos. You need a sense that even though the case has been solved, there's still some underlying current of uncertainty. And that, to me, that's an element of any great PI novel. If I could, I just wanted to steer things back a little bit to the diversity topic, because it's something that's important to me and something I could really relate to as a reader before I became a writer. I think we have a lot of accomplishments, and there's a lot to look back over the years that have been successes, but there's still, I feel personally, there's still a long way to go. I mean, when I wrote the Pete books or started writing the Pete books, it was because I felt as a reader, I didn't see myself, you know, as a PI. I didn't see people like me as private eyes. And obviously, as I read more, you know, I found, you know, Edna Buchanan had a Cuban-American PI, and Carolina Aguilera Garcia had a great series that I've been hugely influenced by. But I think, you know, we're seeing a huge uptick in diverse writers wanting to see themselves represented in this role. And I think that's a great thing. And I hope we can see so much more because I think it's the next chapter for a lot of what we're seeing for the genre. So
I completely agree. And a lot of, basically what the reason my book exists is it's sort of, what I'm trying to say is it gives us a roadmap for the full use of American competence, right? And unless we're using everybody, we're operating at much less than half steam. And and it's curious that the hard-boiled, the traditional sort of white male subset of society, and that is a minority of society, right? That the idea that that is who gets stuff done, that is who is competent, that is who we need to count on. What's fascinating to me is that that is such a draw, or was such a draw, that people wanted this, that readers loved that. And just in the time between when I submitted my manuscript to Hopkins and when it came out, there has been huge progress, right? And more people are writing, more kinds of people, more genders of people, more races of people, more backgrounds of people. And like I said, they are working together. And people do want to see themselves represented, not just on the page, but the ultimate end game is to see ourselves represented in the world, in power, in politics. And I think that there is that line.
And it's not just a one for, I'm sorry, Ace, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you know, going back, I'm talking about Parker. I think Parker felt a certain amount of responsibility to talk about these issues in his books. And I think he was very aware of the kind of people that were reading his books. I don't think men read like they used to, like in the 50s, you know, the 40s and 50s. I think right now, let's face it, most of our readers are women. But I think at that time, he realized that he had a platform to be able to talk about these issues. And did he really, you know, was he able to represent people, you know, that were, you know, characters from, you know, all different walks of life, whether they're Black characters, gay characters, characters of Latin backgrounds, whatever. He really had them all, but I think he really felt like there was a responsibility to meet that message, Susanna, you talked to, which is it takes a team. You know, it takes these people, down to him even creating kind of a, you know, a Magnificent Seven type of, you know, team that included, you know, American Indians, Mexican Americans, gay characters, whatever. So I think that was really his ultimate gift. And I think that's something that as a young writer resonated with me. I had played college sports. I knew that was a fact. I knew that's how that worked. And so that's something that now as a writer working on books, they're not Spencer books, I really enjoy talking about. I like the inclusion of having strong women characters, having talking a lot about race relations, particularly in the Deep South. So I think that's really the wonderful gift that he had. I mean, you know, was Hawk the perfect, I know, Susanna, you've written about this. I read your essay. You know, was Hawk the perfect representation of a Black character? There's a lot to debate about that, and certainly under the lens of looking back at what he did. But I think his intentions certainly were pure in that regard.
Right. I mean, and if the choice is between that and no Black character, I mean, yeah, it's not for me to say because, you know.
I think all the writers.
I'm glad he's there. I'm glad Hawk is there. I'm even glad Susan is there.
Yeah, I just want to point out to anyone who's out there that all the writers here all have very diverse characters in their books. Even Max in Miss Tree, he had a gay character, there were Black characters, and he covered a lot of topics. And Ace, because he's carrying on Spencer's books and in his Quinn Colson books, and Alex, of course, in Miami with the Hispanic community, and that. The genre has always been more of a rainbow collection than people sometimes dismiss it as. And it has, if you look over the last 100 years, because Hammett and Williams both showed up 100 years ago, but you can see how it's diversified. There, even back then, there was a bit of diversity, and it has continued over the ages, and it's getting more and more. As you said, in the last few years, it's just exploded.
Yeah.
What we saw in the early 80s with women PIs, we're now starting to see with every sort of PI. And it's exciting to watch. And
It's
nice
very
to see that the private eye
It's
itself.
yeah, you just get a different story. You don't just have a different version of the iconic white male PI. You get the texture and the culture and you have a different character. And for my money, the best crime fiction reflects the world as it is today and shows you kind of this unfiltered, unvarnished picture of our society. And so, you know, being able to see it through so many different lenses, it's an education, and that's such an important part of what we do, I think.
The outsider aspect of the PI, though, which we've touched on a little bit, is perfect for disenfranchised communities. The idea that somebody within and one detective we didn't mention that was one of the few that really came on strong in that period we talked, the sort of the lost generation of PIs, was Shaft.
Yeah,
that was a hugely popular character. You know, 3 movies, a TV show, a bunch of books. It was written by a white guy, but he was, you know, he was kind of a crime reporter, I believe. But it certainly did take those. It did take all those tropes into at least a different ethnicity. And one of the things for me in seeing the Ms. Tree stuff, it's all being brought back out again. One of the things that is interesting and a little depressing is that we were doing topical issues. We did date rape. You know, we did, what were some of them, Kevin? I mean, we did all that, all the things.
Abortion, pornography, spousal abuse, putting
And the thing about it is,
at the butcher shop, all of them.
yeah, abortion clinic bombings and all this kind of stuff that we did in the 80s and the early 90s. And absolutely none of it is not contemporary today.
I know. It's gotten worse.
Well, what you're saying about the outsider label or the outsider not label, but the outsider quality being kind of perfect for disenfranchised communities, I think paradoxically that's what's made it difficult for culture at large to embrace women detectives and detectives of color, because in a way it's too perfect, right? It's too real, it's too visceral. If you say, you know, I feel alienated from society at large, I wanna do something, I wanna find another way, when in real life, systemic obstacles and repression is so palpable and so omnipresent.
I think, Susanna, that's how Easy Rawlins, Walter Mosley, was just blazed on the scene so clearly. I don't think anybody could disagree that a character like Easy Rawlins existed, or there was a need for him to exist at that time or during the times that he wrote about.
Right.
You know, he was just the perfect character, even though it was a historic character he was writing about this time, that, you know, can't trust the police. The police are all crooked. Situation is bad. It's just the idea that there is, whether it is a man, it is a woman, it is a person of color, in the times like we're finding ourselves now, to find just honest people, you know, just a decent person to do the right thing. And I think that moral code, which Parker wrote a lot about, of course, that all goes back to Chandler. You know, of course, Hammett's characters were a little bit on the moral spectrum as far as, you know, whether they were good or bad or doing it for money. But I think that that's what we need right now. And I think that if we did go back and we look at the last 20 years post 9/11, we are seeing the glorification of the white man and the gun. You know, we see 1,000 books like that. You know, I hope I include a lot more of a diverse cast and have lots of discussion of dealing with race issues, particularly what I write about. But I think now I think we're starting to have kind of a more of a jaundiced eye towards that world. And I think that we're going to be finding a lot. I think The Private Eye is more relevant than ever, you know, and not just as a period piece. Or I love Jessica Jones, but Jessica Jones has that noirish kind of throwback, you know, vintage feel. And I don't think there's anything vintage about A Private Eye these days. I think the modern Private Eye, what that represents, is needed now more than ever.
Right.
There's a beat we're missing though, and that is that, and Parker is the guy really who made this possible. But the women Private Eyes were the big sellers in the 80s and in the 90s. There was nobody bigger than Sarah Paretsky or Sue Grafton. And it was actually, there was a period where it was a little bit hard to get a Private Eye novel published if you were male.
Yeah.
And so they did extremely well. I swear to God, that's true.
Yeah, the problem with both of them, though, was Sue wouldn't sell their character to the movies or TV, and the W.I. Warshawski movie didn't do what it could have.
Yeah, Warshawski. Yeah, I mean, the Kathleen Turner movie and there is that curious disconnect between between the popularity of the character among crime fiction fans and the resonance of the character in the wider world, which at that time wasn't there, I would argue, for V.I. Warshawski.
No.
I mean, I love those books, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
And, but
I think we're in a really, Susanna, and this is, you know, particularly talking about the Private Eye character, we're in a very world-weary time. I mean, I've been watching a ton of movies from the Depression in the 30s, and you know, just the common attitudes towards politicians, towards police, towards the system being broken. We're really sharing that time. This was not the way it was 10, 12 years ago.
No.
We are now seeing completely absolute distrust of authority. Finding the entire world is broken. It is corruption at its zenith, very much like the times of Hamlet. And again, you know, I just think that this, you know, talking about these characters that's what we're looking for. Why do readers like this stuff? That's people who don't read Private Eye. They don't understand what it is. It's about the moral compass. It's not about the girls in the car and about the blood and the shooting. I don't give a crap about any of that stuff. That's not why I write this stuff. It's about the moral compass. It's about the people, yeah.
Yeah, it's the tainted knight. It's about this person trying to seek redemption through their own moral code. That's the through line, I think, at least from the PI novels that resonate to me. I'm sorry.
Susanna, you mentioned something very important, particularly since part of your thesis was to follow the money, kind of who was selling, who had an impact on popular culture and on society. And when you talk about Hammett, it's not the Continental Op, it's Sam Spade. It's that movie, and then the radio show that flowed from that movie that was hugely, kind of forgotten now, but hugely popular. And so Sam Spade it's really Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe, you know, Mike Hammer. So so that element is there, and they all spawned major movies. And if you don't, and V.I. Warshawski, if that movie had been great,
Yeah.
I think it would have taken off on another level.
I don't know. I don't know that that's true. I don't think that America was ready. I don't think America was ready for V.I. Warshawski. There's a difference between being a popular literary character and being a cultural icon. And
True.
I don't think that they were ready. I don't think we were ready for that at that time.
And I mean, we have to remember Maltese Falcon was the third remake. There were two other films. One was with Ricardo Cortez, was terrific in that role. Then they were really bad Betty Davis movie where they tried to do a Thin Man thing. And then when John Huston wanted to make that movie, they thought it was a dead property. You know, so that shows resilience and sticking to the character. But yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Max. Sam Spade, even though he only appeared in one book, there's only one book, only one Sam Spade book, is just everything. Yeah. You know, if you don't like the Falcon, then
well, I had an interesting discussion with Mickey. We were showing. I have a documentary I did about Mickey, and it was shown once. And the guy was questioning. I was there with Mickey, and the interviewer was talking to Mickey, and I was just leaning back, shutting up for once. And came to me for one question, which was, Max, you and Mickey really disagree on something. I said, yeah, whether Kiss Me Deadly is a great movie or not. And Mickey hated Kiss Me Deadly, the movie Kiss Me Deadly. And I said, well, he shouldn't hate it, because if you don't have a great movie that lasts and that resonates through the culture for decades and decades and decades, you know, you're going to be, have written Philo Vance. I mean, it's got to get its cultural claws into you, and Kiss Me Deadly did. And I had a lot of talks to him about it. And I felt like one of the things that were the little victories I had was that one of the last interviews he gave, he was asked, who was the best screen my camera next to you, Mickey, because Mickey had played. And he said Ralph Meeker. So I turned him around on Kiss Me Deadly. He understood that movie, to some degree, made him. I'm not sure we'd be talking about Mickey to the degree we are today if it weren't for that movie made by people who hated my camera and hated that book, but knew just exactly what to do with it.
Well, maybe the Continental Op would have been ultimately better known if they had made a movie out of Red Harvest that wasn't a musical called Roadhouse Nights.
And they never made Dan Curse till a TV movie, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Susanna, have you seen Roadhouse Nights?
I've seen parts of it on YouTube, and
I have a copy of it. I'd be glad to send it to you. It's as bad as you think it is. I mean, when you think about the Continental Lot movie, you don't necessarily think about Jimmy Durante, but it is
Yeah.
bad film.
Definitely not.
Bizarre.
I wasn't expecting to see singing. I wasn't expecting any degree of vaudeville, but there it was.
Yeah, well, we got
Now it'll never go away.
Yojimbo, so at least we got something good out of it.
Leech for our eyes and ears. We could go on forever with this because all I had to do was ask one or two questions. But I'd like to ask the audience if they'd like to ask any questions. So please use the chat feature to send it to John, and then we'll let you ask our panelists a question if you want. I see that some people here have been very active, and I think this is great. I just wanted to invite some other people to join in so that we're all part of the nastiness. Okay, Leslie wanted to say something. This is, I think, Leslie Klinger.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment about sort of historical perspective that the PI has been around for a lot longer than you've been hinting here, and has been popular for a lot longer than this. We can go back to the 19th century and Allan Pinkerton and his immensely popular books. And in 1915, Conan Doyle created the wonderful character Bertie Edwards, probably the first hard-boiled PI. And of course, there were many private investigators that were working in the 19th century in fiction, written by women, among other people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Great point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I did, in the book, I do start, I start where it all starts, which is with Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe and James Fenimore Cooper sort of braiding together to make the curious hybrid of deduction and ease with a gun that is the American character. And I do think that the post-war, and it's curious, the time we're living through now, which is similar to 1918 in some ways, but we'll see we'll see what kind of literary output comes out of our current times. But there is something about the historical and cultural circumstances of the late teens and early 20s, including the rise of white nationalism, that did something special for the hard-boiled detective that we now hold near and dear.
Absolutely. I mean, I think with Hammett coming from that, not only from the pandemic, but seeing the America's First movement of the the early 30s and seeing what's happened. Mm-hmm. I mean, that absolutely polarized him and his view and steeled him in his view. And I don't know. I mean, Susanna, you might disagree with me, but I don't think it can be. If we can say too much about Hammett's example. I mean, of course, there have been all types of detective heroes before that time, before the Continental Lot, before Sam Spade, but I don't know if there was anyone that had the type of realism that he had in those books. And I definitely think, or I know Chandler wrote about it, there would be absolutely no Philip Marlowe, without Hammett, and there would definitely be, wouldn't be Lou Archer, there would be a Spencer, there wouldn't be a lot of people, there wouldn't be Mickey Spillane. I think it all goes back to Hammett. I think he really solidified from what his experience was, that world weariness and why we don't trust anybody.
He put the emotion in it, right? And that's where it, I mean, that's what I love about the Continental Op. That's why actually I love the Op more than Sam Spade, because there's more of it. There's that continuity. You see the stories and you see him, and he's not, handsome like a blonde Satan. I mean, he's overweight. He's got some mileage on him, and he carries that weight.
I always wanted to see Charles Durning as the Op. I think he would have been.
Oh yeah, that'd be perfect.
That would have been great. Someday we'll see something like that.
But the Maltese Falcon is the perfect private eye novel, which invents many of the conventions of the private eye novel.
Yeah.
Everything starts there. It doesn't start in the Continental Op. You have the secretary, you have the two cops, one of whom is friendly, one of whom is not friendly. You have the femme fatale he does everything. He does it great. He does it better than any of us have ever done it, and I don't know why we even try it.
Max,
I'm glad you do.
And it's something I don't think Hammett was ever able to duplicate. I love the Continental Op, and I love those short stories. Nobody is ever going to be able to touch that. And then, we're lucky enough to get a film that is equated with that, which so rarely happens. But there's nothing like the Maltese Falcon. I think he knew what he was doing when he created that. And but it's so funny, it's so funny, Max, you talked about how some of the people didn't respect when you mentioned Red Harvest or that. And it's a shame that Hammett in his own lifetime thought he was a failure. He thought that everything he had created was just pulp and junk, even though Falcon was celebrated in its time as being a literary work. He thought it was just so secondary to anything he had done. He thought what Lilly and Hellman had done was much more long lasting. He thought it was all over. But no, it doesn't. I agree. It does not get any better than Maltese Falcon. I reread it every so often just for for a heavy duty influence.
I think one of the reasons that Dashiell Hammett was sort of down on himself in that way is that he was an alcoholic and maudlin and depressed and sick. He had a lot going on,
I think he thought but he also has been well documented. He also thought he was a failure. So, of course, he was an absolute heroic alcoholic. And of course, the TV problems, didn't help anything. A myriad of issues were going into it. But I don't think he thought what he did was important later on. I don't think he was ever proud of that work. And, Falcon was such an unusual thing because it wasn't regarded as pulp at its time. It was celebrated. Dorothy Parker thought it was a marvelous book. I think it was celebrated very much in the New York press at the time, but I think he thought he was, some quote of somebody said, are you a writer? And he said, I used to be. I once was a writer. I was something.
Yeah.
But
it's so sad.
The consumption of a bottle of scotch every night certainly didn't help his attitude for sure.
No, man.
Yeah, I know one of the things I did kind of disagree with you on, Susanna, was when you said, kind of made a statement that, well, everybody knows that Raymond Chandler is the greatest of the hard-boiled writers.
I didn't say
I would put Hammett first. I
didn't say everybody knows. I
don't remember
said
exactly what you said.
Thinks, or he has become thought of as.
Okay.
I'm sort of referring to the hive mind of the American public rather than me personally as a reader. I love Dashiell Hammett.
That's a hard choice, though. I think
it is really hard.
It depends on the mood. I think I could go either way on a given day.
Yeah,
but very different. I think they had a very different worldview and a very different writing style. I think Chandler ultimately was a better writer. I think he was a better writer. But the influence of Chandler famously wrote he would have never written what he did had it not for Hammett taking the Venetian vase and tossing it into the back alley. And that's why we're all here, because
True.
The grittiness and the realism.
I've always suspected, and I can't back this up at all, I've always suspected he was actually collaborating with Lillian Hellman on a lot of her plays.
I think
I see him in those plays everywhere I look.
Yeah. I think he could.
Hammett had a code of honor
in the
that Hammond
biographies. I think
didn't
it's
seem
fairly
to possess.
well documented, Max. I think he was somewhat frozen from, he was working on this book, almost got to be a
Tulip.
The Tulip, your Tulip. He just couldn't finish this book. But I think he felt his job was to, I think he felt his, his role as a writer was done, and his job was to assist Lillian Hellman and to help her. I agree with you. I think Chandler might be the better writer, but I don't know if he ever created anything as good as the Maltese Falcon.
Yeah,
That's fair.
Mark Henderson has a question about Perry Mason, another guy from the pulps who. Or we could talk about the HBO thing too, if
Careful.
I might need more beer.
Well, we are noir at the bar, so.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Mark.
Hi. Hello. No, I was skeptical at watching the reboot of Perry Mason. And as it started out, he's a PI and probably right after the Depression. And I thought, well, period-wise, I started looking at it and I thought, well, it looks pretty good. And I wasn't too happy. But then I started watching him as a PI, and I was wondering if any of you great authors had anything to, if you've seen it, if you have any comments.
I'll jump in about, I'd like to hear what the other people say, but I will jump in about Perry Mason because it's getting billed as a prequel, right? The idea that, and those of us who have seen the original Perry Mason have that in our heads. And so the idea is that there's Matthew Rhys who is playing this character. And in the back of our minds, we know that in the ultimate arc, he becomes that. And that's where the interest of it lies. How is that going to happen, right? And that's a premise that, I mean, if you're young and watching Perry Mason for the first time just because you love Matthew Rhys, which is totally defensible in my opinion, is you might not think about that whole arc, but it's a provocative premise. The idea that in working as a private eye and being the kind of sad sack yet, forging forward that he is, that his story arc would ultimately end up with him being this steadfast defense attorney and acting as the court, this tireless court of last resort for the wrongly accused. It's kind of fascinating when you look at it from that point of view. Plus,
they took 8 episodes and the transition still doesn't work.
I haven't checked it out. I'm curious to see it.
The last few episodes improved, but my problems with it, I can always take something on its own terms. My problems with it have a lot to do with the anachronisms. The dialogue is so wrong. They used in the last episode, Perry Mason said something in a New York minute. And then there was a farmer in a field talking about shell companies, and then they talked about enablers, and then and then everything's got to be turned on its head. Yeah, I'm all for diversity, but so Della's a lesbian, and Hamilton Berger is gay, and Paul is black. I don't really care, but
you forgot that they hadn't invented razors back then.
Well, the real problem, though, is rooted in the characterization. The guy starts out in the first episode, he tries to blackmail his client. And then a couple episodes later, Della Street wants him to be a lawyer because he's got such a great sense of right and wrong. He apparently blackmails in a very positive way, I guess. I mean, this characterization is so really slipshod and not thought through. It's one of those things where you come away humming the art direction. I mean, it really does make me mad because of the possibilities what they could have done. They're spending many millions per episode on that, and they're recreating the 30s in a beautiful way. I wish I had access to that for Nate Heller, and I won't. I'll tell you why I'm so mad. They told me yesterday that they're not taking Nate Heller out because Perry Mason's sitting there. And, so I'm a little resentful of that. But please do the characterization right. Please don't, if you're going to get the drapes right, can you get the dialogue right? Can you not have Perry Mason talking about throwing shade on somebody in 1931? I mean, it is just absolutely insulting to the viewer.
Let's face it, Max, the least important thing always on that is the lowest level. They've got art director. There's the lowest level is the writer. But I agree with you. If we can get the drapes right, can we please get the dialogue right? I hate seeing that too. But I think it goes back to what you're talking about, Susanna, talking about, iconic characters that really capture the imagination of Americans, people that we know. We all know Perry Mason, even if they're younger people. They never watch. They don't know who Raymond Burr is. They don't know what's going on. But I think that's what we're getting into in Hollywood. I don't think they took on this character, and I may be completely wrong, because the possibilities of the prequel. I think it was just it's an intellectual property. What's something that we can make out that has an instant brand name? What's a character with an instant brand name? And I saw that firsthand with what they did with Spencer. And they took Spencer, made a Netflix film out of it. It has absolutely nothing to do with Spencer, absolutely nothing, but it was a brand name to use. I think we're going to see more of that. I'm sure, Max, have you seen anything with Mike Hammer?
Mike Hammer is kind of in the pipeline right now, but I saw the director, very good director, Tim Van Patten, was interviewed, and he was asked, he literally was asked, well, why didn't you do Sam Spade, or why didn't you do Morla, or why didn't you do Mike Hammer? He said, well, Robert Downey Jr. had the IP, the intellectual property to Perry Mason, so we thought we'd do that because we wanted to do one of these hard-boiled noir characters. So that's how much thought went into it initially. What IP they had available, because it's just absolutely maddening.
Well, to Alex's earlier point, I'd rather see new people than reboots at this point, because the reboots are, I love these characters and I love a reboot, but really what's really for the good of the genre and for the good of the world, I think is the new characters.
Well, Susanna.
Yeah, it's not a reboot if you're changing every element of the character. It can be a prequel, but
why even do it? It's like they tried a few years ago to do the Rockford reboot. I don't know if you were able to see the pilot, but it's
why do it?
Why do it? You can't. Let's face it. There's only one James Garner. Nobody else is Rockford.
Exactly. Thank you, Ace. Thank you.
Oh, I left something out about Perry Mason. You know how he becomes a lawyer? Hamilton Berger wants to run for district attorney. He wants the district attorney to get beaten. So he basically cheats with Perry Mason so Perry Mason can pass the bar. And Perry Mason studies to be a lawyer for 2 weeks.
Yep, 2 weeks.
And then becomes Perry Mason. I say it's spinach and I say to hell with it.
I'm curious. I just want to ask, as a sort of, just out of curiosity, who is you guys' favorite Mike Hammer on screen? When I was a kid, and I think my dad and stepmom are on this call, we used to watch Stacy Keach as Mike Hammer, and although that was my first exposure to the character, he looked like something out of an English country house, and it didn't seem to me, it didn't jive physically. So, who do you guys like?
I have to say, I like Stacy Keach. I think he's a terrific. I think he's an underrated actor, and I thought he's got kind of an edginess to him. So, of course, "Kiss Me Deadly," you can't get that out of your head. That's such an iconic film. Yeah. But I think, as far as the long run, looking at something episodic, I thought Keach was pretty good.
Okay.
Well, I don't actually have a favorite. Jim Traylor and I did a book on Mickey Spillane on screen. And I thought Darren McGavin was a terrific Mike Hammer. He brought some humor to it, but he was still very, very tough. Biff Elliott, the original, and I, the jury, was criticized a lot, but he's very much a roughneck Mike Hammer. Armand Asante was pretty great, and Stacy brought the humor to it that he had to do. And I don't like that kind of campy approach, but it worked at that moment. You mentioned something, Susanna, that really resonated with me about the era. Jay Bernstein, the producer of Mike Hammer, when I interviewed him for the documentary, he said, I knew when Ronald Reagan got in, Mike Hammer could get on. And that's how he sold Mike Hammer, because of that moment. So you're dead right about that. Yeah. And so here I am, a liberal, continuing the Mike Hammer stories, which just proves I'll do anything for money, obviously. Apparently not very much money, but yes, I'll do anything for money.
Fair enough.
It was such an honor to be here, and Susanna, you wrote a great book, and it's
so
amazing
much.
to just be up here with Ace and Max in this virtual meeting room. And Kevin, I used to read your website before I even started writing, so even just seeing a Pete Fernandez bio on there is a thrill. So.
Well, thank you for giving me
I've
something to
also
fill that
managed
page with.
Yeah, I feel bad to bail early, but we have a 15-month-old that is.
Well, say hey to the kids and thank them for lending us their dad for a while.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. Ace, Max, good to see you guys.
Good to see you, Alex.
Thank you,
Susanna,
Alex.
congratulations. Thank you.
Well, Susanna, congratulations on the book. I think
Thank
all
you
of us
very
are very thrilled anytime writers and academics bring some kind of serious study to this world and to the genre. It gives us more credibility and it makes us look a lot more respectable. So thank you very much.
It's a real new take on it, and the historical aspect that you bring to it and explore makes it very special.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's a pleasure for me to be here with you guys. So thank you for coming in.
Thanks, guys.
I have a totally impertinent question, but with the earlier part of the conversation about private eye is, independent and, the lone knight, given our day and age and what's going on right now, which PI would wear a mask and which ones wouldn't?
A mask. Oh, I see.
Good question. It's a good question.
That kind of mask, Kevin.
Yeah, I was watching Watchmen last night. So, how do you know that? Who would wear them? I think
Spencer would.
Spencer would.
Spencer would wear a mask.
Yeah, he's definitely.
Hawk
Spencer
would wear a $5,000 one from Yves Saint Laurent or something, but even Hawk would wear one.
And Spencer and Susan would have a long conversation about the mask and about what it meant and about the responsibility to wear it.
Well, unfortunately, the problem right now is writing a Spencer novel is considering half the book is going out and eating at nice restaurants. I think it's going to be a much shorter novel.
Yeah, I think
it's very difficult. I can't imagine writing a scene with a private eye with a mask on interrogating somebody either. That's going to be very, very tough.
Yeah, I could see Mike Hammer out there not wearing a mask, but not letting anyone within half a mile of him himself either.
Well, my Mike Hammer would wear a mask and be slugging the people who aren't.
Oh, good.
Okay.
I like that.
Because Velda would wear a mask.
Velda would definitely wear a mask and shame him into it.
Oh, that's it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Even better.
Rockford would wear a mask, and then as soon as he got into the trailer, he'd sort of take it off and throw it on, on the table next to the door and kind of shake his head at them. Yes.
Harry O wouldn't wear one at all because he never goes anywhere. He's still working on that boat.
I know, exactly.
And the buses aren't running.
And his car is broken down, I guess.
Yeah. Anyways, I want to thank everyone for coming. This was really, really great. I'm so glad all I had to do was start one or two questions and you took off. And next time you guys all meet, allow me to eavesdrop again, because this was really a lot of fun for me.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you everyone out there thank you everyone who came and who listened. We appreciate, I really appreciate your being here. And thank you, Kevin, for moderating.
And Susanna and Max, nice meeting you guys virtually. Hopefully we'll meet in person and slug back.
Ace, a pleasure.
That sounds great.
You guys, very much so.
Thanks, Susanna.
Okay, thank you. We'll see you guys soon. Take care.